welcome to Nazarene Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and I'm the apostle for the restoration of the original first century faith. And in this third part of Revelation Simplified, we want to talk about seals 5, 6, and 7 and the rise of the New World Order. In this video, we're only going to talk about part of the information that you can find in the full study, Revelation and the End Times, which you can obtain. You can read it free online at nazareneisrael.org, or you can purchase a paperback copy at our cost from Amazon.com. But in part 2 of this video, we saw how at the first 4 seals, there's a releasing of 4 what might be called horse forces. And we saw that at seal 1, we saw the release of a white horse, which corresponds to the biblical patriarch Joseph. At the second seal, we saw the release of the red horse, corresponding to the biblical patriarch Esau. At the third seal, we saw the release of the black horse, corresponding to the biblical patriarch Judah. And at the fourth seal, we saw the release of the green horse, corresponding to the biblical patriarch Ishmael. And people have asked, there's a lot of information in the Revelation study, and people have asked, how did we come up with the parable of the pregnant bride? And the parable of the pregnant bride is a mnemonic device that Yahweh gave to me to try to help people keep things sorted out, to try to make sense of all this jumble and mishmash of information. And we're going to try in this part to help you understand the timeline a little bit better. So in the parable of the pregnant bride, we're all basically familiar with the concept of how a woman goes through a 9-month or a 40-week gestation period where she bears a growing burden. Now, the horse forces are released in the first half of this. The seals 1 through 4 is the releasing of the horse forces, and then the horse forces marshal the people and the nations and the armies of the earth towards this end time tribulation. And so what we're going to see here today in seals 5, 6, and 7, this is important to remember, it is still part of the growing burden, that the bride has not yet come into the time of tribulation yet. Then in other subsequent parts of this video series, we'll talk about the trumpets, which we are calling the tribulation as being symbolic of her labor pains, the thunders being symbolic of her cries of pain, and the cups being symbolic of her waters breaking, with the redeemed man-child, redeemed Israel, being born at Armageddon. And we're going to talk a lot more about this. But what we need to remember in this video series, this part, is that we're still in the seals. We're still effectively in the gestation period. And there's going to be a lot of difficult material that we're going to cover in this video, a lot of things that we need to remember to see with spiritual eyes. Because a lot of the things that are going to happen are not going to be pleasant from a human standpoint, but they will be worth it eventually. So in John chapter 16 and verse 21, Yeshua tells us that a woman, when she's in labor, has sorrow because her hour has come. But as soon as she's given birth to the child at Armageddon, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a human being has been born into the world. And one of the things, we need to bear that joy in mind. We need to keep our eyes on the prize, so to speak. But we also need to bear in mind that Yahweh's ways are different than our ways, and they're higher than our ways. So what we see as very difficult end time events, Yahweh sees as an opportunity for us to prove our faith, to live by our faith. And hopefully, if we live by faith, we will also die in faith, because there's a much greater and better reward. In this part, we'll see that those who die in faith, they're going to go to the throne room, versus those who do not die in faith perhaps may go on to the new earth. So there's a different trajectory depending upon how we serve him with the time that we have. So we're going to rejoin the timeline now. We're going to come to Revelation chapter 6, starting in verse 9. It says, "And when he opened the 5th seal," now we've seen the 4 horses released. And he says, "When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of Elohim and for the testimony which they held." And this might be going all the way back to, say, the 1st century and the time of the apostle or the disciple Stephen. So, and it says in verse 10, continuing, it says, and they cried with a loud voice, saying, how long, O Yahweh, set apart and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? It says, and then a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer, until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren, who would be killed as they were, was completed. So again, this may not be happy in human terms, but we're going to see that those who die in this context are given a white robe and they're in the throne room. We'll talk more about that as we go on. But I believe that this is the fifth seal basically began opening around the time of 9/11, or the September 11th tragedy in 2001. And not that 9/11, not that we can say with certain calendar precision that the fifth seal began exactly on September 11th, 2001, corresponding with the tragedy. But what I'm saying is that since this point in time, since 9/11, we've then seen the rise of what's called the Arab Spring, which is still going on today. We've seen the rise of the Islamic State. We've seen Islam becoming much more active. We see Iran on the move in Syria and in other places. And we see a large, basically Christian genocide, both in the Middle East and in Africa and in other parts of the world. So things are becoming more difficult, and a lot of Christians are dying at this present point in time. But again, the point is, if we die in faith, if we live in faith, hopefully we die in faith. And if we die in faith, as opposed to just believing, there's a better reward for us at the end. And hopefully, Father willing, we'll talk a lot more about that as we go farther on, because that's the real message. And that's the real reason for studying the book of Revelation, is so we can live in faith and serve him to die in faith. So picking back up in verse 12, it says, I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake. Now, we need to understand we can take a look at these things at physical fulfillments, and we also need to take a look at spiritual fulfillments. With regards to physical fulfillments, we've been seeing very much heightened earthquake activity over the past several years. Someone said at one point there's perhaps like a doubled incidence of earthquakes. We've seen earthquakes in strange and various places. The Pacific Rim of Fire is essentially on fire. But we're still looking for a great earthquake, and this is something that would probably impact either Judah in the land of Israel, or it would affect Joseph, or we might even say Ephraim in the United States of America, because these are the sort of the two lead tribes for the two houses. Now, if we want to take a look at the spiritual aspect of thing, we'd be looking for basically more or less a societal quaking or a societal shakeup. And these kinds of things would happen in the wake of a nuclear conflict, like we're talking about here. So continuing on in verse 12, it says, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood. So there's various different ways we can interpret this. Again, there's both physical and spiritual fulfillments, and we're looking for both. So in the realm of physical fulfillments, some people tie this to the total solar eclipse, which traversed most of the United States from west to east, happening on August the 21st, 2017. And Father willing, if we get time, hopefully we'll show there's a lot of other prophecies that play into 2017. It's 500 years from the Protestant Reformation. A lot of other, there's Jubilee cycles that tie to 2017. There's a lot of other information that points to 2017 as a key critical year. A lot of people have said it's a very different world in 2017 than it was prior to 2017. And this is one of the things we saw with the fifth seal, is it was a very different world on September the 12th, 2001, than it was on September the 10th. You know, they talk about what a difference a day makes, but September 11th was very much a turning point. So August the 21st, 2017, this took place just prior to the fall festival season. And again, we'll show that there's a lot of other prophecies that impinged on 2017. There's also supposed to be the next iteration of the total solar eclipse on April the 8th, 2024, or some 7 years later. And just as the total eclipse on August the 21st passed through a lot of towns with biblical significance names like Salem and these sorts of places, the total eclipse coming on April the 8th is also supposed to cover these kinds of things. And so with a 7-year term, we'll have to see what transpires. We could also look for physical fulfillments of the moon turning to blood. We saw a series of blood moons take place over the Israelite festivals in 2014 and 2015. There was also what they called a one-time ever occurrence that took place on September the 23rd, 2017, which some researchers and some scholars tied to Yeshua's birth at 3 BC, and they tell us that it was perhaps the fulfillment of Revelation chapter 12, starting in verse 1. Now remember, Revelation 12 is an inset chapter. So Revelation 6 is a timeline chapter. Revelation 12 is an inset or an informational chapter. So this information can go where it fits in the timeline. I'm not arguing for this, but what many scholars say is that Revelation 12 and verse 1, it says, "Now a great sign appeared in heaven," which is a woman, and symbolic of spiritual Israel, clothed with the sun, which would be symbolic of Yeshua's spirit, and with the moon being symbolic of Torah under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars, which could be referring to the 12 tribes. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And those who follow the astronomical signs, they talk about how the constellation Virgo had, I believe it was Saturn or Jupiter, pass between her feet. And I don't want to comment on that, but we also will see that when we get into the Jubilee cycles, we'll see that there was a Jubilee significance regarding the return of the house of Joseph or Ephraim that took place at 2017. So once again, we're talking about a redeemed man-child being born as one of many fulfillments that's mentioned in this passage. So if we want to talk about spiritual fulfillments of this, this is a depiction of what's called the Roman black sun, and it's a symbol of Roman occultic power. And you can see it, it's part of murals and frescoes and paintings and cultic engravings in occult buildings throughout the world and this sort of a thing. But there is great significance to the sun and the moon and the light that Yahweh gives. So for example, in Psalms 119 and verse 105, we're told that Yahweh's word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. Well, the written word of Torah is, which our brothers in Judah follow, it lights our path like that of the moon. It definitely lights our path, but it doesn't give us anywhere near the same amount of light as with Yeshua's spirit. Yeshua's spirit lights our pathway like the sun. But what can we say if there's a Roman sun, or a rise in Roman occultic power, or a Roman occultic spirit of Yeshua, the occultic spirit of Yeshua? Could that pertain to the sun becoming black as sackcloth of hair and the moon becoming like blood, perhaps if we have a corrupted version of the Torah that's brought about? And we know that the rabbis are talking about the Noahide laws, and we know that the Roman Catholic Church has its own particular canon law. And what particular kind of canon law or canon Torah would we have underneath a new world order? We can also tie this to Joel chapter 2 and verse 31, where it tells us the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of Yahweh. Now, the great and awesome day of Yahweh, that again is a reference to the cup judgments, the cups being poured out. It's not necessary. It's not a reference to seal 6. So, but we would see the sun turn to blackness and the moon turn to blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of Yahweh. So picking back up again in the timeline, in verse 13, it says, "And the stars of heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree drops its late figs when it's shaken by a mighty wind. Now, it doesn't make a lot of sense to think about this as a physical fulfillment because it doesn't make sense physically. But if we think about this in terms of missiles, it makes a lot of sense. And it also makes sense in terms of demons because certain demons would be released in this kind of a nuclear war. So verse 14, it says, "Then the sky receded as a scroll when it's rolled up." And most commentators tell us that this is a reference to a nuclear conflict or a nuclear war, probably centered in the Middle East, that may spill over and go worldwide. Now we'll see, and a lot of people, the reason we're mentioning this is a lot of people believe that Seal 6 will be this global nuclear all out. But we don't believe it's going to be, it will involve the whole world because that's why we're going to end up with a new world order as a result of this. But we don't believe the conflict will be an all-out nuclear conflict. That's more the cups. Again, the great day of his wrath comes later. And we'll emphasize that again when we take a look at the chart. So continuing in verse 14, it says, "And every mountain," which mountains are symbolic of governments, "and every island," islands are symbolic of national boundaries, "was moved out of its place." And this is the kind of thing that we would expect to see if there is a nuclear conflict, an engineered or prepared nuclear conflict. We would expect to see national borders and boundaries displaced because we're seeing a societal shaking going on. We're seeing the horses have marshaled all the armies and nations and everything, and now there's a great shaking. And so now all the borders and boundaries of the nations are going to be shaken and shifted as well, culminating in the rise of a new world order, with the United Nations most likely brought to full power. Continuing in verse 15, it says, "And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, 'Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand?'" So what's important about this is there's going to be a lot of people who are going to believe that this is the great day of his wrath. But it's not the great day of his wrath. It's only Seal 6. Now, this is the simplified version of the chart that we looked at before. The great day of his wrath is the fifth line down. That's the 7 cups. Or the cups or the bowls of wrath that are poured out upon the harlot Babylon. And we'll talk more about that. That's when Babylon is judged at trumpet 7, and then Babylon is destroyed during the cups or the cup judgments. So we're still here on the second line down, third column from the right. That's the 6th seal. So we have a long way to go before we get to the great day of his wrath. And we'll talk more about this chart as we go. Now, we bring this up because then questions arise. It's a very important letter that was written by a Freemason by the name of Albert Pike. He was a 33rd degree Freemason and the leader of Freemasonry in North America. Apparently he had a dream, an occultic vision, and he described this occultic vision to his fellow Freemason Giuseppe Mazzini. Now, one of the things we need to know about this letter is that it was written in 1871. And this letter from 1871 uses terms that were effectively not really even invented yet. This letter introduces terms that will show up in the regular vernacular later, but were not used at that time. So he says, "The First World War must be brought about in order to permit the Illuminati," which is Black Horse, "to overthrow the power of the czars in Russia." And we know that the czars were Christian czars, so it was a white horse kingdom. "And of making that country a fortress of atheistic communism," which is the red horse. "The divergences caused by the agentur, or the agents of the Illuminati between the British and Germanic empires will be used to foment this war." And that is effectively exactly what happened. Remembering this letter was written some 40 years prior to the First World War. So then he says, "At the end of the war, communism, which is the red horse, will be built and used in order to destroy the other governments and in order to weaken the religions. And he's talking about the white, black, and the green horses. And Father willing, hopefully we'll be able to talk about that in more detail in part 4 of this video series. He continues on and he says, the Second World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences between the fascists, which was red horse, so the National Socialists, again, socialism is red horse, and the political Zionists, meaning the black horse, and this is one of the reasons for the Holocaust. It says this war must be brought about so that Nazism, again, a term that was not in regular use at that time, was the National Socialism, or the red horse, is destroyed, and that the political Zionism, or the black horse, be strong enough to institute a sovereign state of Israel in Palestine. During the Second World War, international communism, which is red horse, must become strong enough in order to balance Christendom, which is the white horse, which would then be restrained and held in check until the time when we would need it for the final social cataclysm. And this is effectively what we saw both in the First and the Second World War. But in the Second World War, we saw the red horse destroy the black horse to justify the rise of a state of Israel in the Middle East. And in the wake of the Second World War, we also saw this tension and balance of power in the Cold War between the Christian West and the communistic or atheistic East. And we'll talk hopefully more about that in part 4. So he says the Third World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences caused by the agenture, or the agents of the Illuminati, between the political Zionists, I mean the state of Israel, the black horse, and the leaders of the Islamic world. And then this is the tension that we see building right now. The war must be conducted in such a way that Islam, the green horse, and political Zionism, or the state of Israel, mutually destroy each other. Now, there's a lot of people who are going to say the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand. One of the reasons we don't believe that it's possible for this to take place at Seal 6 is that we're going to see that there continue to be Muslims and Jews and Christians after Seal 6. So that's very important for us to understand. Let's continue on. I want to finish reading this dream, although these next parts of the dream don't apply to Seal 6, but we need to see how they apply later at the time of the cup judgments, at the time of Armageddon. So he continues, meanwhile, the other nations, once more divided on this issue, will be constrained to fight to the point of complete physical, moral, spiritual, and economic exhaustion. Now, this sounds like the warfare during the cup judgments, during Armageddon. He says, we shall unleash the nihilists and the atheists, and we shall provoke a formidable social cataclysm, which in all its horror will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, origin of savagery, and of the most bloody turmoil. Again, it's too soon for these things. Then everywhere the citizens obliged to defend themselves against the world minority of revolutionaries will exterminate those destroyers of civilization, and the multitude disillusioned with Christianity, whose deistic spirits will from that moment forward be without compass or direction, anxious for an ideal but without knowing where to render its adoration, will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, finally brought out in the public view. This manifestation will result from the general reactionary movement which will follow the destruction of Christianity, or the white horse, and atheism, meaning the red horse, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. And again, what we're saying is that this pertains more to the cup judgment. Here we go. This pertains more to the cup judgments and Armageddon. So the cup judgments being the 5th line down, Armageddon being the 7th line down. It's too soon for that yet. We're still on the 2nd line down at Seal 6. So just to bear it in mind, but this is the direction that they want to take us. This is the direction that we are moving. I just believe that this nuclear war, this nuclear conflict that's coming up at Seal 6 won't be enough to complete that. Could be wrong, but this is my understanding. I'm sharing my understanding in my studies with you. So what then should we believe? Well, if we imagine a nuclear war taking place in the Middle East, it's easy enough to imagine. We just take a look at the news headlines. And so if a nuclear war takes place in the Middle East, and then what happens if the United Nations asks the Pope to broker a peace agreement? And then what if the Pope decides to work a peace deal with his Muslim allies? And as we saw in in past parts of this video, Esau dwelt halfway in between the state of Israel and the wilderness of Paran, where Ishmael lives. So we also saw that the Esau intermarried with Ishmael. So the papacy and Ishmael are very close. So and there have also been documented, we show this in the book, there's various agreements that lead us to believe that the papacy may move its throne to the Temple Mount in the wake of Seal 6. And all that the Pope would have to do at this point is he would have to reconfirm the existing Catholic Christian dogma that Islam is also a faith that leads to salvation. So that was a picture of the Pope kissing the Quran. So then what if the Pope builds an interfaith temple with the outer courtyard open to all? And then what if the world leaders hail the papacy for bringing about a peace that, of course, is not really peace, but he brings peace in our time, or such and so to speak? And then what if the papacy goes on to raise a new generation with a united world religion, and the people of the world come to believe that this is the new normal? We have a united religion on the Temple Mount with the papacy leading the Muslims together. Would that fulfill 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, starting in verse 3, which says, "Do not let anyone deceive you in any way, because that day will not come first unless first comes the falling away, and the man of sin, or the man of lawlessness, or we might say the man of Torahlessness is revealed, the son of perdition, the one opposing and exalting himself over everything being called Elohim, or object of worship, so as for him to sit in the temple of Elohim as Elohim, showing himself that he is Elohim." And we know that the papacy, in effect, the Pope already has a throne. He already sits on this throne in the Vatican. But how much more if his throne were to be moved to Jerusalem? So we're going to take a look at this chart one more time. Now notice, second line down, third column from the right, we have Seal 6. So in the second line down, we've seen the 4 horse forces released, Seals 1 through 4. Then we've seen the dead crying out and being given a white robe at Seal 5. Now, here at Seal 6, we see the sky receding like a scroll, and every mountain and every island moved out of their place. A great social shaking going on, calling for reordering and reorganization. So now we're going to come to the inset column. So the assemblies, I don't know if you can see this on your screen, but the assemblies, the top row, is informational or inset column. And then we also see inset chapters on the 4th column down is 12 through 14. And on the 6th column down, informational chapters 17 through 18. But on the 2nd column from the right, we see inset chapters. So what we're going to see here, we've been in chapter 6. Now we're going to go to chapter 7, and it doesn't necessarily follow in order on the timeline, but it belongs here, so to speak. So we're going to see this inset chapter at chapter 7, and then we're going to go on to see the half hour of silence at Seal 7, which then opens up the trumpets. So continuing forward, this is inset chapter, not on the timeline. So Revelation 7, an inset chapter, he says, "And after these things, I saw 4 messengers, or 4 angels, standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, on the sea, or on any tree. Then I saw another messenger ascending from the east, having the seal of the living Elohim. And he cried with a loud voice to the four messengers to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, until we have sealed the servants of our Elohim on their foreheads. So what this is telling us is telling us that a time of harm is coming up, and this is consistent with the time of the trumpets. So this is why I believe that we're talking about the sealing of the 144,000, and they will be sealed from harm through the majority of the trumpets, at least through trumpet 6. So continuing on in verse 4. He says, and I heard the number of those who were sealed. 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel were sealed. Verse 5, he says, of the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. So there's the representative for the southern kingdom. Of the tribe of Reuben, 12,000 were sealed. The tribe of Gad, 12,000 were sealed. Asher, 12,000. Naphtali, 12,000. And then he says, of the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000 were sealed. And we need to understand about Manasseh. Manasseh, at least in some form, represents the United Kingdom, the ex-British Empire. So of the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Simeon or Shimon, 12,000. The tribe of Levi, 12,000. And that's interesting because Levi's not always numbered in the numbering of the tribes. Of the tribe of Issachar, 12,000 were sealed. Of Zebulun, 12,000. And then it says of the tribe of Joseph, 12,000 were sealed. And of the tribe of Benjamin, again, southern kingdom, 12,000 were sealed. So we see some interesting things here. Ephraim as a tribe is not mentioned. We see Manasseh and we see Joseph. Joseph technically includes Ephraim, and we'll have to talk about speculation and theories as what that means in some other place. We talk about that a little bit in the book study. But we notice, again, Levi is mentioned, which is not normal, and they're sealed from harm, I believe, until such time as trumpet 6 at least, but they don't make it quite to trumpet 7. Is because, again, we're talking an inset chapter, and so the reason why is because in verse 9 it says, after these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands. One thing I should add, we'll see later that the 144,000 show up in heaven. So what this passage is saying here in verse 9 is he's saying after these things, so after the sealing, and remember this is an informational chapter, it's an inset chapter taking place before seal 7, which is going to unlock the trumpets. It's going to unlock the tribulation. So it's giving us some information about things that are going to happen after these things. So after these things, I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes. And what this tells me is that this verse takes place in the throne room in heaven. Because, and continuing on in verse 10, it says, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, salvation belongs to our Elohim, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. They're crying out. They're standing before the throne, and they're dressed in white linen or white robes. So this means to me that they're in the throne room in heaven. Verse 13, then one of the elders answered, saying to me, who are these arrayed in white robes, and where did they come from? Sort of testing him, so to speak. And I said to him, Adoni, you know, basically, sir. So he said to me, these are the ones who come out of the great tribulation, and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. And we know that the great tribulation follows the seals. So we have the seals on line 2, and then we have the trumpets or the tribulation, which takes place after that. So that's why we need to understand that this is an inset chapter, an informational chapter, and doesn't pertain to the timeline. But he says, verse 15, he says, therefore they are before the throne of Elohim, which is in the throne room in heaven, and serve him day and night in his temple, and he who sits on the throne will dwell among them. Verse 16, they shall neither hunger anymore nor thirst anymore, The sun shall not strike them, nor any heat. The reason why is because they're dead. They don't get hungry. They don't get thirsty anymore. They're standing before the throne. Verse 17, it says, for the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them and lead them to living fountains of waters. And Elohim will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And this is one of the things we need to know, we need to understand, is it doesn't say, people are always trying to make the 144,000 live through the tribulation, so to speak. But it's the wrong way to look, friends. So what we need to do is we need to live in faith. And I don't just mean we hypothetically believe, but I mean we live our faith. Because if we live in faith, we will die in faith. And these are the ones who go to his throne room in heaven, having proved their faith by the fact that they died in faith. So that's why they're in the throne room in heaven. So continuing on to verse 8, it says, now when he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. So we have some various options. Again, so seal 7 is opening up the trumpets, but there's a time delay for a half an hour in heaven. So we have basically put our thinking caps on. We have three main options here. We could be talking about a literal 30 minutes, which doesn't make a lot of sense with regard to the text. Or we could be talking about a day for a year following the principle in Ezekiel 4, which yields about 7.5 days, which once again doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in the context of Revelation. But then we have a third option, which is the principle of 2 Peter 3 and verse 8. One prophetic day as being equal to 1,000 earth years, and 1,000 earth years as being represented by one prophetic day. And if we do it that way, it comes out to 20.83 years, or 20 years and 10 months. And this is enough time for a new generation to be raised with a new normal under a new world order, with world government, or at least the United Nations brought to full power, at least in the Middle East, but probably globally, and also with being taught a united world initiative, or united world religion, which they've been working on for some time. So continuing on to Revelation 8 and verse 2, it says, and I saw the 7 messengers who stand before Elohim, and to them were given 7 trumpets, because the next thing on the agenda is the opening of the trumpets. So here we've had the seals, seals 1 through 4, releasing of the horse forces. Now in this video, we've seen when the dead cry out. We've also seen the nuclear conflict at seal 6. We've seen the sealing of the 144,000 who will later die. Again, remember the inset chapters, they operate on a different time frame. So we've seen the sealing of the 144,000 who will die during the tribulation. And then now in seal 7, we see the trumpets being handed out to prepare for the blowing of the 7 trumpets, or the 7 shofars, which will be the 7 years of the tribulation. And we hope to talk about that more in part 5 of this video series. But before we get there, we're going to talk more about in part 4, we hope to talk more about the New World Order government structure itself. So again, just to help people place themselves, there's a lot of information. So in the parable of the pregnant bride, in part 2, we saw the first 4 seals opening up. Here in part 3, we've seen seals 5, 6, and 7, and the preparation for the blowing of the trumpets, which will be the tribulation. We're talking a 7-year tribulation, which correspond to the bride's labor pains. If you'd like to know more information, I encourage you to get a copy of the study Revelation and the End Times, available for free at NazareneIsrael.org. I hope you join us again for part 4, where we talk about Esau and why he's both representative of the Vatican and of the New World Order government, and we'll see how that all fits in and plays in together. Shalom.